Well, welcome everybody to our final webinar in our series on nature, soil and climate-friendly food production and land use. That beautiful piece of music was Clannad, Ancient Forest, and it does evoke a time, doesn't it, in the past when the UK was covered in native woodland. Tonight, we're going to welcome two people who are doing their best to restore that back to how it was and also make a bit of money for farmers and landowners at the same time. We have Angus Dixon tonight. He's the founder and owner of Groves Forestry based in Moray, Scotland. Angus is an independent forester and he's worked with farmers on estates for almost 30 years, planting woodland and hedges. And Angus is also a member of our in-house Stockfree advisory team. We also have James Hepburne Scott with us tonight, the co-founder of Forest Carbon, who since 2006 have been engaged in woodland creation and peatland restoration for carbon capture and also ecosystem services. Their programs are certified by the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code, respectively. James was the chair of the Scottish Forestry and Timber Association in the early 2000s and was amongst one of the first to identify the need for carbon funding to kickstart UK woodland creation. And if you look on Forest Carbon's website, you see their projects and they cover the whole of the UK. They have planted 13 million trees since their inception and sequestered 3 million tons of CO2. So in a moment, we're going to welcome Angus, first of all. Please remember that the chat will be off for the duration of the webinar. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and I hope you have loads. And at the end of their talks, we'll pose the questions to Angus and James. So please welcome, first of all, Angus Dixon. And Angus, you should be able to share your screen now.
Okay, has that done it?
Great, that's absolutely great, yes.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Angus Dixon. My talk is whether woodland should be planted on farmland, land on farms. Woodlands have many great benefits for wildlife and landscape and carbon capture and as beautiful places. But my presentation is simply about the finances to help people think through whether it's a good idea to plant woodland on land they have, or maybe not. So slide number 1. Funding for woodland creation comes from really 4 broad sources. It comes from Scottish Forestry, Forestry Commission as was, and they give grants for planting woodlands and for fencing and protection of new trees, and they give grants for maintaining the woodlands. You get 5 years of maintenance grants. These grants are generously funded, so it's more than enough to plant woodland. RPID, the department as was, they will continue to pay basic payment on land, agricultural land that's planted up with trees. So that's a helpful addition. And then carbon credits, which we'll be hearing more about later on, those are available for less commercial woodlands. So if you've got land where you can plant a really productive timber woodland, you wouldn't get the carbon credits because it'd be considered too much of a successful commercial enterprise. And finally, timber sales. A conifer wood, very often you start to thin them when they're 20 years old, and you carry on thinning them, and then very often they're felled at 45, 50 years, and so the value of the timber, which is now has historically increased in recent years, so that's a big thing. So should you plant your land with woodland? And there are various questions that we should consider. Land quality. If you've got good arable land or land with improved grass, generally I would say it's best to keep it in agriculture. I have done planting on arable land, but very often it's for shelter belts. So the farm won't be giving up a whole arable field. It'll be the edge of the field for shelter. Actually, we'll see in my first example, that is an arable field, but that's a field that has been sold by a farm to somebody who's not a farmer, and it happens to be an arable field, and they'll be planting it. So land quality. Unimproved pasture, it is with rushes or bracken or some heather, a bit of heather. That's very often that's the land that's suitable for commercial forests. It may be a bit poor for agriculture, but it's good for productive tree growth. When you go further up the hill onto poor heathland, heather or wet areas, that's more land for native broadleaves or Scots pine, very often, a sort of acid heathland. And that's the sort of land that would maybe less good for timber production, but good for native woodlands and good for carbon payments, which we'll hear more about later. The location of land is also important. You might have a nice bit of land on a cliff top by the sea, but salty winds are bad for trees. Also, trees don't like high altitudes because of the cold and the windy conditions. And the third thing is you might have a nice bit of land for tree planting, but there's just awful access, or it's too difficult. And so you might be able to grow good timber, but you can't get it out. And so location is important. So question is and also looking at the land, what else could you do with the land instead of woodland? So you need to compare the benefits, the financial benefits of woodland with what else you could do if you were with agriculture or something else. So a couple of slides here showing the sort of unimproved land that is poor for agriculture, but good for trees. So this is this possibly was improved land long ago, but it's gone back, and this land here was never improved. This is heathland, which would be Scots pine planting area, or native woodlands, native broadleaves. And so we'll look at the examples of the costs and finances of woodland creation. Number one is Steel End, and this is the arable field down in Fife that's been sold, and it's going to be planted as a woodland, and it's going to be planted with native broadleaves. So this woodland will produce some timber one day, but in the distant future, because broadleaves take a long time to grow, and not very much woodland. And so what are the costs of doing it? The costs on this one are constructing deer fences and gates, and preparing the ground by very light ploughing, just to open up the turf to reveal soil for planting. Buying and planting the trees, that's almost 7,000. And although the new woodland is going to be surrounded by a deer fence, the trees need guards to stop rabbits and hares eating them, and also voles, which can be a nuisance. And then we allow money for weeding the trees for several years, and replacing failed trees. Not every tree that's planted survives the first year, and you need to fill up the gaps. And then the costs of applying for the grant scheme. And so if we look at the income and costs, Scottish Forestry grants, the big grants are for the planting and for the fencing and the guards in year 1, and then the next, also there's a maintenance grant in year 1, and then the next 4 years you get a maintenance grant of a couple of £1,000. The woodland will get carbon, well, sorry, CS, that's the Central Scottish top-up grant. If your farm is in the Clyde Forth Valley area, which includes much of Fife, you get an extra bonus. You don't get that elsewhere. So that's the 5,000, nearly £900. Basic payment, I just put that in, it's nothing because the people are not farming the land, they're not farmers. So if it was a farm, whatever the basic payment paid at the moment on the land would continue. Then there's the carbon grant, which James Hepburne Scott will tell us about later. For this woodland, because it's not going to be a productive timber woodland, 7,400. So giving a total income in the first year of 36,000, and then it's just the maintenance payment, and then a second instalment of carbon in year 4. And the costs, which we looked at just before, those costs are spread over the 5 years, most in year 1 with the establishment, and then maintenance, which tails off each year as the trees get established and get bigger. You need less weeding and fewer replacements. And then the bottom here, we have net income. So a bit of a surplus in the first year, a cost in the second year, and then a little bit, nothing much in year 3, and then rather more year 4 and a bit in year 5. That is a little woodland grant scheme. A big one is number 2, which is up in Murray. It's a very big one. It's 160 hectares of heathland hillside, and that's going to be 100 hectares of Scots pine with some broadleaves mixed in, and then 30 hectares of Sitka spruce, which will produce a lot of timber, and 6 hectares of larch, which will be productive for timber, and then 21 hectares of native broadleaves, which will just look nice and produce habitat. The costs of the big woodland are a lot of money. It's $250,000. Deer fences to surround it. There are red deer in the area, as well as roe. There's ground preparation on a big scale, a lot of trees, and guards just for the broadleaves. The conifers hopefully will look after themselves, and then quite a lot of money on weeding and allowance for replacement, and big scheme, so it's more complicated to apply, so more money needed there. And so there's costs and grants to summarise. The Scottish Forestry grants, 365,000, and then a decent amount of maintenance each year. Basic payment, again, I put that in, and there's nothing there because it's such poor land, it's not receiving anything. The carbon grant paid in year 1 and year 4, a substantial sum, so very worthwhile having. And total income, most again in year 1, and then less in years 2, 3 and 5, and boosted up by more carbon money in year 4, means that this scheme is a positive one for cash flow each year. The owner's very keen to do that. So those are grants and establishment costs, and then really looking further ahead, and especially for a woodland like this with a chunky amount of commercial conifers. And this is just generalizing, but a plantation of Sitka spruce produces about 60 tons of timber per hectare when it's thinned every 6 or 7 years, starting, as I say, from the age of 20 until it's 40 or 50 years of age. And the plantation would be felled at around 50 to 55 years old. On the more fertile the site, the earlier the plantation is clear felled, because sawmills don't want huge logs, they want standard sized ones. And at felling on that sort of site, you'd get about 500 tons of timber per hectare. And that's this is example. This is a woodland in Wester Ross, and it was a mixture of Scots pine and Sitka and Norway spruce being felled, and the revenue from a typical Sitka spruce woodland, first thinning, each thinning you get about 50 tons of timber out. The value of the timber, though, increases as the plantation, each thinning, the timber's worth more, and the reason is that in the first thinning, most of the timber you take out is chipwood, and it has a decent value, but it's not worth as much as saw logs. So as the plantation trees get bigger, each thinning you get more saw logs out, and so the value goes up. So when you come to do the clear felling, most of that £18,000 is from the saw logs. There may be quite a bulk of chipwood or small roundwood, but the money really comes from the saw logs. Just a little note on tax and forestry. A nice thing about timber sales is you don't have to pay any income tax on it. The flip side of that, though, is that when you're spending money on your woodland, you can't say, well, I've just spent £1,000 on weeding the trees, I'll just put that against farm income. You can't sort of have your cake and eat it. So if you're spending money on most farm maintenance, of course, all that's set against income, but woodland expenditure isn't. And the other main thing with tax and forestry is forests are they're not subject to inheritance tax. And conclusion, I think woodland creation might be the right option for you, but you need to look at your land, look at the alternative uses for the land, and then just do the sums and see whether it's the right thing. Many people like to have woodland because it's a lovely thing to have, but when you're looking at your farm in the cold light of day, do the sums. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Angus, for that really thorough talk and the wonderfully clear examples. So I think you could, that's right, stop sharing that. Thank you. Hope everybody's saving your questions to the end. And now we should have James able to share his screen.
And am I visible and audible now?
There you are. Yes, we see you.
Good. Now.
There you are.
Okay, so just before I launch into my presentation, I want to introduce somebody else who is sitting beside me. And I think if I twiddle this thing round, can you see yourself? This is Gordon sitting on my right, who is a member of our team at Forest Garden. He and I are both sons of the soil. We've both grown up on hill farms and know our way around livestock world. And Eck leads for us on farm woodland creation projects. And he's helped me with all these slides, but he's going to come in at the question time to help with the discussion. So bringing that back to, I can't see myself. I'm there. So the title of the webinar said that I was going to demystify carbon credits. I hope I will to a certain extent. I don't promise to demystify it entirely, but I would like to assure everybody present that our role is to demystify it for you step by step as you work through your project and bring it to fruition and fulfillment. And that is our role, is to guide you at every stage through the Woodland Carbon Code processes. Eck's going to move the slides for me. So we've been going since 2006, as Rebecca said, and we have enabled the planting of over 250 woods throughout the UK and some in Ireland too. Strictly speaking, thank you, Rebecca, for your introduction. We haven't planted the 3 million trees. They have been planted by our farmer and landowner clients. They've done that themselves using their own labour and their own contractors. All we've done is to enable that planting through generating extra finance to bring the project from not quite financially viable to, yes, it is financially viable. Our role is to generate finance to turn what I call amber light projects into green light projects. Nor indeed have our woods sequestered, what do we say, how many million tons of CO2? They've done very little so far, but they are calculated and predicted to do that over the growing lifetimes of those woods. So all shapes and sizes. Our smallest wood is just under 2 hectares and our biggest is 500. The one thing they've all got in common is they've been co-funded by the sale of certified carbon credits. That's what made them possible. And they all provide a wide-ranging range of benefits. As you all know, it's not just about carbon, it's about the wider biodiversity benefits and water quality, sometimes natural flood management, and sometimes recreation, which could include shooting or whatever. So there are a wide range of benefits, but the carbon is the bit that we can most readily measure at present. And they've all been quality assured under either the Woodland Carbon Code or the Peatland Code. More of that in a moment. But just to emphasize that our purpose today is what it was in 2006 when we started, to enable more woodland creation through the provision of further additional finance to turn your slightly unattractive project into a financially attractive project. So I want to stress that we are entirely operating in the UK voluntary carbon market, which means that this is a voluntary activity for our customers. The people that buy the credits are not obliged in any sense to do this, which means, among other things, that if the price goes too high, they will be turned off and they will go and do something different. They will either buy where it's cheaper, or they will apply more carbon reduction methods and processes to their businesses, because it will be more financially attractive to reduce carbon further than to offset it. It follows axiomatically that they're all doing their best to reduce carbon emissions already, and they only turn to offsets when it is the only financially viable thing to do. Now, they might be doing this for slightly different reasons. Some of them are doing it because they have set net zero targets and published them, measured on the Science Based Targets Initiative, and that requires them to report solid, verified carbon in the years ahead. Or they may be doing this just to fulfill internal corporate social responsibility targets, to tell their clients how they're a greener widget maker than the widget maker down the road, and they're just trying to create a good impression for themselves, but they're not wanting to report verified carbon reductions. And they will have, as I say, different motivations. Should mention that there are other codes around the corner. We've got woodland and peatland, but I mean, before long, we are going to see some form of soil carbon code, and maybe salt marshes, hedgerows, carbon from the ocean. And I personally think before any of those come into reality, we will have a viable market in biodiversity credits, but we don't have time to talk about that at this moment. While just on voluntary, I should make the point that you will hear people talking big numbers about the price of carbon. And in some cases, I think they're not talking about our voluntary carbon market. They may be talking about compliance markets, such as the EU emission trading scheme or even the new UK emission trading scheme. Those are compliance markets, quite a different matter from our voluntary market. Quality assurance is absolutely essential. We have the Woodland Carbon Code, we have the Peatland Code, and I won't dwell on the details of those at this stage. But perhaps just to say that the Woodland Carbon Code is there to make sure that projects are genuinely additional, and I'll talk about that in a moment, that they're well quality assured, that the calculations are conservative, the woods will be there for the long term, and they will be properly monitored and reported on. All this is to give the customer, the end buyer of the credits, confidence that they're buying something which is safe and sound and reliable. Both peat and woodland credits are registered on the IHS Market Registry, which is the international carbon standard that all the big environmental and carbon standards, around the world use, and based in New York. And the registry essentially provides confidence to the buyer that they're not buying a credit that's already been sold to somebody else. That's the absolutely essential. So every single ton of carbon credit, whether it's a forward sold or whether it's a solid carbon unit, can be traced from where it's come from, who has bought it, whether it has been retired or not, and whether it's beyond use. So that's the registry side. Now, I think at this stage I should stress what it is that we at Forest Carbon can do for you, the farmer woodland creator. I said at the beginning, we're there to guide you and hold your hand through all the processes and deal with the mystery and the complications, because it is complicated. There's a lot to get your head around, but if you're doing it every day, it's quite straightforward. And EC would be your guide, your guardian angel to take you through all the processes which I'm about to say here. But essentially, we are there to help you with the initial carbon calculations, to take you through the validation and the future verifications, to find the right buyer for your carbon credits, and to strike a deal that satisfies your needs and theirs. So this is a slide borrowed from the Woodland Carbon Code. And if I use the pointer here, can you see my pointer flipping around? Can you see that? So the first stage is at the very beginning, before you plant a single tree or put a stub in the ground, we will have hopefully received an application from Angus describing your project in detail and with a budget and cash flow attached. That enables us, first of all, to do a carbon calculation from which we can predict how much carbon this woodland will capture over anything from 30 out to 100 years. And it also enables us to assess confidently that the project is genuinely additional. And I will say a bit more about additionally in another minute or two, additionality. So having done that, you're confident to go ahead and plant your wood, knowing that it will qualify for carbon credits. Within 3 years of planting, but preferably as soon as you finish planting, we will put this through the validation process with the Woodland Carbon Code. That is us submitting something called a project design document, complicated document, which EC prepares. A lot of data goes into that. We submit that to the certification body, which will probably be the Soil Association. And once they approve that it passes all its checks and balances, it ticks all the right boxes, then pending issuance units, known as PIUs, will be issued. That is the promise of future carbon capture. More of that in a moment. So you have listed PIUs, which are listed on the market register. Then at year 5 and subsequently every 10 years after that, or more if the customer wants, but let's say at year 5, 15, 25, the project is verified. We or somebody else qualified to do it will come out, count the trees, assess their growth rate, make sure they're healthy, not being destroyed by any creatures or damaged by anything. And then we put something called a project progress report into the certification body. Again, EC does the heavy lifting on that. And then the pending issuance units are converted to woodland carbon units, which are solid carbon that has been locked up. And that can be sold in a different way. More of that in a moment. So just to illustrate these two different kinds of credits, here is a hypothetical wood which is predicted to capture just under 4,000 tons of CO2. over its growing lifetime of up to 100 years. So you've got about 4,000 tonnes. You could, in theory, sell all of those 4,000 units up front and take all your money in now. We don't think that's a very good reason. I'll come on to why in a moment. You could alternatively sell all or some of it in slices as it arises, as the trees grow. You can see here the green bars. There's only a tiny bit at year 5, which you can't even see. Year 15, you've got 500 tonnes. You've got another 1,000 tonnes at year 25 and another 750 at year 35. And the trees are still growing, but they're growing more slowly going out into the future. And so that is the sale of pending issuance units, PIUs. That would be the sale of woodland carbon units, which are solid carbon credits, which you can sell once your PIUs have been converted in slices or chunks to solid carbon credits. And they will probably command a higher price because they are solid and they're there and they're, if you like, guaranteed. Next. So let's get down to the 2 case studies which Angus outlined for us. Here is Steel End. Now, I'm going to put my specs on at this stage so I can see the numbers. Steel End, the calculation shows that it will capture just over 2,500 tonnes of CO2 by year 100. Most of it is captured by year 55 or 60 because the growth levels off. Trees grow slower as they mature. The blue element of that is 20% of the total. And that is a tonnage which is creamed off every single project that goes through the Woodland Carbon Code, and it goes into the code pooled buffer, which is owned and maintained by Scottish Forestry, and it is there as a collaborative or cooperative insurance buffer for all projects through the code, which means that if your project meets a disaster, which might be fire or windblow or some new disease, and cannot deliver the carbon it has promised to deliver, let's say at year 30 it meets a disaster, it can claim back all the verified carbon up to that date from the buffer. You are obliged under your contract to make good the damage, to replant the wood, so it's advisable to have it insured, to replant it, and then the damaged part of the project starts to regrow and starts to reaccumulate carbon from which you would repay the pool buffer at the end of the contracted time. So that's the blue bit, but the bit that you've got available to sell is the green bit. Now, as I said before, we would not recommend selling 100% of that carbon forward. And there are 2 or 3 reasons why we would not recommend that. First of all, it is very likely that in the lifetime of your carbon contract, which could be anything from, let's say, 30 years out to 100, the property will change hands, maybe several times. It would be a very good idea for there to be some unsold carbon credits still attaching to the project, so that whoever buys it has got a bonus of carbon credits waiting for them, registered and being verified every 10 years, that they can then sell for cash as time goes by. That gives them the incentive to look after the wood, to carry out the verifications and have a nice cash income coming in further ahead. What the price will be, we don't know, but there's general expectation that it's got a bit further to go up yet. In any case, we fully expect solid carbon credits to be worth more than the promise of future carbon. Have I missed out anything, reasons for not selling it all? Okay. I think that's a bit. So on Steel End, we're quite happy that this project will qualify for carbon credits because, as you saw, the cash flow from Angus, there is no future income to come in, bar a bit of firewood perhaps from future thinnings. So we know that it will pass the additionality test. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment. 75% of the units at year 45, that's what we typically recommend now. That is somewhere near half the total, in this case a bit more than half. 75% of the 45-year total would be 1,237 units. If we were buying those units today from you for a fixed price today, that would be in the region of £15 a tonne per PIU. Might be a bit more depending on the location and the various attributes of the project. You would receive that money from us on this fixed price offer. You would receive 40% of that on completion of planting, 7,425, 40% following validation, 7,425, and 20% following the first satisfactory verification at year 5, 3712. So that's not quite the same as you said, Angus. 40% on completion of planting, 40% at validation. Now, validation, as I said, should happen pretty much as soon as you've completed planting, and it should be validated typically within 6 months. If there are issues and complications, it might be longer, I would say maximum 12 months. But you have 80% of your money comfortably within 12 months, and the balance following the first satisfactory verification. Okay. Now, here is Lynn of Carron, and we did the sums initially on the way Angus first presented the project to us, which was for 160, I think, gross hectares, of which 72 were going to be Sitka, 61 Scots pine, 20 of broadleaves, and about 6, I think, of larch. And you'll remember that this was a lot of ground preparation on an organomineral soil. So this project is actually a net carbon loss up to somewhere between year 15 and 20. It's in the minus zone, so you have no carbon credits to sell. Also, it levels off much earlier than the native project at Steel End because it's going to be thinned and clear felled. And once it's clear felled, you're obliged to replant it, but you can't sell any carbon credits from the second rotation. So actually, whilst the carbon grows faster once it's in a credit situation, it levels off and you fetch up with a lower score. So in this example, if we took the 45-year point, bearing in mind you're going to clear fell the conifers at year 50, at the 45-year point, and you take 75% of that, you have 9252 units available to sell. If that was at 15, which is, we think, achievable, that's 138 grand, of which, again, 40% on completion of planting, 40% at validation, that's comfortably within year 1, and 20% of the first verification in year 5. But there is a major problem here, next, which is the dreaded word additionality. So I'm going to explain that to you now. So get your eyes and ears wide open. This is quite complicated. Additionality is a term which is referred to by carbon credit projects and indeed biodiversity projects and all sorts of credits of this nature in environmental projects around the world. Additionality means the same thing everywhere, broadly speaking, that this project would not have been able to proceed without the benefit of the carbon finance. To do otherwise would mean that the buyer of the credits was paying for something that was going to happen anyway. They need to know that it was their money that made the project possible. They unlocked the project, which would not have happened but for their investment. Now, the Wood and Carbon Code has updated the rules because this is, I have to say, a very subjective assessment. And it is in the eyes or the minds of the beholder, which might be a farming family around a kitchen table, trying to decide whether to plant or not to plant. So we acknowledge that it is subjective, but we can't make this assessment on a subjective basis. So the code has introduced very strict rules which say we compare the financial value, if you like, of the farming that's happening on the land at present. And we compare that with the financial value of the woodland that is proposed to happen. So they have taken a lot of the guesswork out of this and uncertainty by applying fixed values for the cost of establishing the wood, fixed values for the price and volume of timber to be harvested, fixed values for Mr. Beck, income foregone, depending what kind of land you are on. And there's a very simple, rather simplistic way of calculating that. Are you in an LFA or non-LFA? Are you livestock or arable? And that's broadly it. And there's a sort of lookup table that says what would be the level of income foregone per annum on your bit of land. And the other thing that is fixed is the same discount rate that we apply to reach a net present value, and that's 3.5%. The farm income foregone values will be updated every year, and the timber price values will also be updated in the light of the annual standing timber sale index. So this table, if I can just take you through this step by step. Top line is what we call business as usual. That was the farming that was going on there before. which I think in this case is LFA livestock, I think. Correct me, Angus, you're probably on mute, but this is less favoured area livestock. 177 gross hectares. No trees planted, so that no Sitka, no Scots pine or anything. And the calculator says that the net present value of farm income per hectare is £1,751. And additionality doesn't apply. The whole scheme, as presented to us by Angus in the first iteration, was 160 hectares of planting, 177 gross, 17 hectares of open ground, 160 planting, 72 of that to be Sitka, highly productive, well, as he said, mainly productive, highly productive, 61 of Scots pine, 21 of broadleaves, and 6 of larch. The conifers would be thinned and felled at year 50. The broadleaf element would be not intervention, that'd be just allowed to grow on. The net present value of that, using this formulaic approach, is £4,618, nearly double that of business as usual, and it would fail the additionality test. It would not qualify for carbon credits. So we ran that in a what-if scenario by reducing the proportion of Sitka to find the tipping point. Still 160 hectares of planting, but we reduced the Sitka from 72 to 33, and the Scots pine went up by the same amount from 61 to 100. We left the broadleaves and the larch the same. In this scenario, the conifers would still be felled, thinned and felled at year 50, and the broadleaves, no intervention. The net present value spat out by the calculator, 1757, which to all intents and purposes is identical to business as usual, 1751, 17571. We would call that a marginal pass. So any area of Sitka less than 33, that will pass the additionality test and qualify for the carbon funding, which I will illustrate in a moment. The third scenario was that we ran it at Angus's suggestion, which was to take out the Sitka altogether, and there was just 72 hectares of planting, which would be 52 of Scots pine, 21 of broadleaves, and no larch. The pine and the broadleaf would be left with no intervention, just left to grow on. That would produce a net present value of minus 3535. That is obviously a very clear pass for additionality. We also ran this, and I haven't shown it on a line here, that if you just grew the Scots pine and the broadleaves, but you did thin and fell the Scots pine, that would produce a net present value of minus 1394. So you could still afford to take the timber out of your Scots pine and still pass the additionality test. The point about this is you've got to do every project on its merits, and there's a degree of finesse in the design and adjusting the proportions to find out what is optimal for the project that you want to do. Next, so here is Lynn of Carron with a reduced proportion of Sitka. This was, if you remember, taking it down to just 33 hectares of Sitka and 100 of Scots pine. Now, you can see here that because we're doing extensive ground preparation on organomineral soil, and there's a lot of fencing and plastic tubes, etc., you're in a minus carbon score up to about year 17, which is typical. You have no carbon to sell until past year 15. Then it grows away very quickly. Then it levels off after year 40. Only the broadleaves are still continuing to grow because you've harvested the conifers and you've replanted them, but you can't sell any carbon from the second rotation. So if we did the 45-75 formula again, 45 years, 75% of the tonnage, you would have 8743 tons to sell. At our notional £15, that gives you 52 grand, as Angus said, at completion of planting. It's number 52 at inside year 1 and 26 at year 20. So next, please. So this is the one where we ran pine and broadleaf only, just as an example. I think, sorry, Angus, you and the client have decided that's not what you want to do, but if you did, it's quite interesting. So I produced a slide for this. you can see that the carbon, you've got less loss initially because it's a small area. This is only 72 hectares, I think, planting of pine and broadleaves. And in this example, the pine and broadleaves, the pine would be harvested, but the broadleaves carry on growing. You've got 11,712 tons to sell, and that brings you 70, 70, and 35. So there are 3 examples of the sort of money you can get if you decided to sell your carbon forward. When we get to questions, I'm sure somebody would like to ask about other ways of marketing the carbon, different formulas, and we'll deal with that when we get there. So I think that's it, Beck, isn't it? Last slide. So for any questions, I'm sure Angus would be very happy to take them. But if you just scroll on, there you've got my email and mobile number. But actually, I'm the grandfather in Forest Carbon now. I'm not full-time and not all that compos mentis. So Eck there, he's your main man. And there's his email and his mobile number. And so he would be the man guiding through the demystification. So we'll just go back to questions, Eck, if you like. We're going to, yes, there we go.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, James and Eck. That was great. It's complex, isn't it? And yeah, I have a couple of my own questions. But Sam, I think we have a question in the Q&A.
Yes, we do.
There.
So Lawrence asks, how do you factor in inflation in future costs for a project if income is determined at the start of the project?
Is that question directed at Angus or us from a carbon point of view?
I think it was maybe for you, James. I think the question came in during your presentation, but both of your please answer. Well,
there are 2 parts to the answer. As far as inflation of costs in determining additionality, that it doesn't come into the formula. It is the present costs today and today's implied produced value of future timber price. So inflation does not come into that. As to inflation in potentially the future price of carbon, yes, that may very well happen, but we have no means of predicting that. What goes up can always come down. I think it's going gently up at the moment. We think it's actually plateaued off a little bit at the moment. It may go up or down. I cannot predict, but there is always the potential. And as I did say, we do believe that inherently solid carbon, verified carbon, is worth more than the promise of future carbon. The bird in the hand is worth more than the bird in the bush, if you like. So I think there is a prospect of higher values for selling woodland carbon units and pending issuance units.
Great, thank you. We haven't got any more questions just now, so if you want to ask your questions, Rebecca, we'll see if anybody else has more.
Yeah, just to sort of clarify on the additionality thing, James, which was very interesting. So if the net present value of the current farming that's taking place on the land is higher than the potential of the carbon credits, then that scheme would be denied then. Am I right? Is that basically how it works?
Do you like to take that, Ed?
It's not necessarily going to be on the value of the carbon credits. It's more judged off the net present value, the value of that land once it's converted to forestry. So that's why we see the likes of cypress, spruce, productive woodlands failing on additionality, because they're making a good enough economic case off their own back without the use of carbon credits. That's essentially where we're seeing.
I see. Okay.
So yes, I can tell by your face, Rebecca, that you don't 100% see. So just to amplify what Ed said, what we're comparing is the hypothetical net present value of farming that is going on there up to now with the hypothetical value of the forest as planted without the addition of carbon. Those are the 2 things we're comparing. And if it passes the test, then you add the carbon and off you go.
I see. Got it, I think. Yeah, thank you. Interesting.
We've got another question that's came in from Claire. Does anyone know if Wales offers similar forestry grants to Scotland for planting woodlands?
Yes.
Yes. Do you want to go on, Angus?
Yes, England and Wales have their own grant scheme, which is much more generously funded than the Scottish one. I think it's about 3 times as much. However, in Wales and England, getting the grant is much more difficult than in Scotland. So any heather in England and Wales cannot be planted, and peat of any, I'm not sure what the depth is, but you can't plant very much peatland at all. And there are many more hoops to jump through in England. So very good grants, but difficult to get.
I should have added to my bit about additionality that the one thing which is not standardized for each project as it is analysed is the grant receivable. So Angus will be submitting to us the cash flow and budget for the project, which will show the grant expected to be received. So we feed that into the calculation on a project by project basis.
I've you know, come across a crofter actually who planted a significant amount of woodland, and this is probably a question for Angus, and it's about the having to fund it up front yourself, and wait for reimbursement, and went into substantial debt, which due to it took Scottish Forestry quite a long time to do the plantation, went into significant debt, which was quite hard. Are there any sort of things to help with that, or any suggestions for people who are contemplating planting trees but worried about having to fund it or take out a loan initially?
Yes, the Scottish Forestry have a loan scheme themselves, which is an interest-free loan. So when you apply for grants, if you need money for cash flow, then you can take out a loan from the Forestry Commission, and that solves or addresses the problem that a lot of people had some years ago, especially where people would plant their woodland or do the hedges on their farm, and then they had to pay the fencing contractors and other people, and there was no sign of the Forestry Commission, or it was actually the Scottish, it was RPID paying up the grants, and sometimes they took months to cough up, and there were a lot of cross people around. So the loan scheme is a way of dealing with that.
Right. Is it 100% loan? Sorry.
I'm not sure, because I haven't applied for one for anyone as yet.
But
I'm
that was
wondering
also
about the interest rate as well.
Yeah, that was also the reason for us bringing forward front-loading our carbon payment to get 40% on completion of planting, which should be before you've had to pay most of your bills.
Right, I see.
Yes, I think possibly forest carbon might be a quicker source of payments than Scottish Forestry.
I see. Okay, interesting. Yeah. I think it's really exciting, isn't it, that there's going to be soil carbon credits in the future and biodiversity credits. That's very exciting. How far off do you think that might be?
Well, there's already organisations that are dealing in soil carbon credits. We're seeing a number of companies that are engaging with farmers and I think selling those credits on. There isn't a vehicle such as the Woodland Carbon Code or the Peating Carbon Code operating in the UK market at the moment. There's an organisation called the UK Sustainable Soils Alliance who are looking at introducing a code similar to the Woodland Carbon Code or Peatland Carbon Code. But I think at the moment, they are actually going to scale back their ambition and just look to provide guidance on the kind of minimum standards that some of these organisations are already operating should be meeting. Because quite a lot of the time, well, in some instances, there's just a black box within the organisation, which the numbers go in and the numbers come out. So we're not sure how much confidence that's giving to potential buyers of those credits, but there are already transactions happening in that market.
I think we should also slightly scale back our ambitions or expectations of how much soil carbon gain there would be on a form of livestock, you know, on intensive animal farming, if it were. That will level your great vision.
I'm losing your sound, James. I don't know if everybody else is losing your sound, but I'm losing your sound.
Yeah, I think the sounds disappeared a wee bit at the end there.
Could be your Wi-Fi, but
Can you hear us
Yeah,
okay now?
yep, I can hear you, Ek. Yes.
That's better. Yeah.
Do you want
Yeah,
you were just sort of saying, James? I think what you were saying, we've got to not have huge expectations about soil carbon, basically,
Yes.
based on the type of farming.
We don't have the metrics yet available to do the calculations, but it is my sense, and I know a bit about soils and different sort of land management situations, but a grassland farm, whether it's improved or unimproved grassland, will have inherently higher carbon status probably than an arable field, but it has relatively little potential to increase its organic matter and hence its carbon score compared to an intensive arable situation. So I don't think livestock farmers should get too excited about how much soil carbon they might have to sell in the future. But in any event, a message I would leave the meeting with is that every farmer should be setting out to do their own farm carbon audit now, using one or other of the available toolkits to baseline what their farm carbon situation is now, and then to update that every year or every 2 or 3 years, so that if along comes a supermarket or Scott Beef or whoever, the tatty merchant, you know, you'll be able to show them where you started and your progress on your journey to decarbonising your farm. And that's the best advice I can give to anybody today, is get started on this decarbonising process.
Yeah, that's great advice. We did have a webinar last week, Ian Tolhurst from Oxfordshire, and he has a stock-free organic horticulture place, and his soil carbon has gone up since, you know, he has seen it increase. So I think it is possible to add soil organic matter and increase your soil carbon, depending, like you're saying, on the methods. And I think possibly Lawrence has too, but Lawrence has another question, I think, Sam, doesn't he?
Yeah, we've got some more questions came in. So Lawrence asking, how could the carbon market develop for carbon sequestration for a cropping rotation? For example, in a 5-year rotation, 1 year in 5, a farmer grows a crop that returns to soil for carbon capture.
So at the moment, the way some of these organisations are operating is they take a baseline of your how you're operating at the moment. So if you're, say, ploughing the soil every year, they'll then give you the incentive in the form of carbon payments to change that to something like zero tillage, which will improve your carbon stock within your soil. They won't have there isn't currently, I think, the affordable technology to do that every year, that carbon measurement. So normally that's going to be off a 5-year rotation. And I think you struggle probably to have just one crop improving that soil for 1 year if you're kind of taking away in the other 4 years. You've got to show over those 5 years that you've increased the amount of carbon.
That's great. Got a question from Claire. Would forest carbon say there's a minimum useful size of land to be planted with trees to make it worthwhile, whether that's 1 hectare or sorry, 1 acre or 10 acres?
Yeah, and Claire, I think you asked the question around the Welsh grant system. I think it's called Glastir, which is GLASTIR. In terms of useful, in terms of size of projects, I'd say getting mixed up here in terms of hectares and acres. 2 hectares is probably where we're seeing our minimum at the moment. That reason being, whilst registration with forest carbon is free, validation and ongoing verification isn't. So below that size, the amount of units a project typically will sequester might not make it sensible to go forward. But it's worthwhile registering that project because by the time you get to validation or year 5 verification, it could be a different landscape in terms of the price of those units.
Great. Got another question from Mary. What's about carbon sequestering from having new ponds on the wet areas?
I think if I can field that again. At the moment, I don't think there are any standards out there. What you're probably most likely to see, as James alluded to, is the development of a biodiversity code. So I would have thought wetland creation areas, things like that, would fit quite comfortably under biodiversity. So that could well be something that comes up in the future for insects, birds, fish, etc.
That's great, thank you. That's all the questions for now. Still got a wee bit more time to see if any more questions came in. I did have one question actually. You mentioned about there being storm damage to woodlands, and I guess I could see that being more of an issue in the future. Is there any way to mitigate it at all?
I think that's one for Angus.
Yeah.
Well, you can do mitigation. Might just be the design of the forest. Forests that very often they start blowing down at a weak point. So if you plant a forest across wet areas, then the trees can't root very well and tend to blow down. Or if the forest has drainage ditches through it and those ditches aren't maintained, then you get a flood in the forest, and that's where the trees blow down. And rectangular blocks of conifers on exposed areas, they're more likely to blow down than, if you design them nicely with broad leaves on the edges so that the wind flows over them rather than crashing into the side of a tall face of conifers. But this sort of modern design of forestry, it makes forests look nicer in the landscape, but it also reduces wind throw and storm damage. The only thing is that the best designed forest will get damaged by the strongest wind. So there's no guarantee at all, but you design them and do give it your best shot to reduce the risk. So that's what we try and do.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question, because of course with Storm Arwen at the beginning, I think it was the beginning of this year, wasn't it? A lot of trees were down. And James, you mentioned that you can insure your woodland. So if you have insurance for it, does that cover losses, timber losses and carbon credit losses as well? What does the insurance cover that?
So the movement, at the moment, the insurance industry is moving quite quickly to get into covering carbon credits as an insurable risk, but they're not really there at the moment, or those that are, they're very, very early stages. What you'll typically see, I think, on the insurance side is going to be timber loss, and that's going to be to fire, wind, not disease usually, and that's normally what they're covering at the moment.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I have one last question that a farmer asked me when I was doing the farmer's survey, and the topic of carbon credits came up, and he had trees that he planted a few years prior and was asking me, I think the answer to this is going to be no, by the way. He asked me if he could sell the carbon credits on the trees that he'd already planted, but I'm thinking what you said on additionality would probably make that a no. Is there anything for farmers who have planted trees that they can sell their carbon credits?
No, there isn't.
Oh,
No.
it's a shame, really, isn't it? When you put money into a plantation and you're sequestering carbon, but because you are not verified, before the beginning of time, it's too bad.
Where I think there's credit, where I think those would do have value is when he does his farm carbon audit. Those will have a positive score, and they will be helping him to show that his farm is a cooler farm than the one next door that hasn't got any trees on it, because they will be capturing carbon and they will go into his farm carbon audit statement, even though he can't sell those carbon credits. So it was still a good thing to do.
Oh, that's a really good point, James. And I remember you and I talked about this in the past, didn't we, about if the Scottish Government is looking at each farm becoming carbon neutral, that sometimes it's good to hold on to those carbon credits rather than sell in case you need them to balance out your own farm.
Yeah, well, I would like this to be my last point of the evening, because it's something I get quite heavy about. I think that the farming sector, which I consider myself to be a part, deserves some very clear guidelines very soon from government. Personally, I think it should be DEFRA, i.e. UK government, because we need one standard to cover the whole UK. In what constitutes a carbon neutral farm? What would it look like? Or are we going to go on playing around with Morrison's wanting carbon neutral beef and someone else wanting carbon neutral tatties, which personally I don't think is the way to go. I think you need to look at your entire holding. And personally, I think net zero for a lot of farms is probably a bridge too far. But what everybody can do is set off on a journey to gradually decarbonize their farm and show the journey they're on and the progress that they're making. And never forget the added value through the biodiversity as well as just the carbon, because we have a biodiversity crisis as well as a carbon crisis.
Yeah, fantastic. That's a great point to end on. Yeah, and I agree with you on that. Thank you. Thank you so much, James and Eck and Angus. We've just got one last slide to put up here, and I want to thank everybody who attended tonight and the speakers, and I know many of you attending have been to all our webinars, or at least most of our webinars. If you missed any, you can access them through the link stockfreefarming.org/beyondthepossible, and you'll be able to click on any of the ones you missed, which will take you to YouTube, where you'll see our new YouTube channel. I think we just launched that a few days ago. And if you subscribe to our channel, you'll be able to watch future things that we put up there from Stockfree Farming. So please subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you think of any other questions after the end of tonight, you can contact us at contact@stockfreefarming.org. And I'll be happy to forward questions on to Eck and James and Angus if they're okay with that. And please feel free to browse our website, stockfreefarming.org, and see some of the farm transitions, including planting trees that are up there. So thank you again to the speakers tonight and to all of you for coming along, and hope you have a great rest of the evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
Okay.
you.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Good night. Good night.